Welcome to the Basics of Proposition 98, a tutorial for state policymakers from the Legislative Analyst's Office. I'm Rachel Ehlers.
And I'm Edgar Cabral.
This presentation is intended to cover the basics of Proposition 98 at a very high level and will last about 20 minutes. This tutorial is designed specifically for state-level policymakers, and information is provided through the lens of what a policymaker needs to know. The presentation is broken into three distinct sections: a high-level overview of background and general information, an introduction to the mechanics of Proposition 98 with a review of its formulas and vocabulary, and finally, a discussion of the major budget decisions that policymakers face each year related to Proposition 98. Before you dive into this exercise, you might ask yourself, why should I bother to learn about Proposition 98? Here are a few reasons. To start with, it's the largest area of the state budget, over 40% of annual state general fund spending, and it's a key factor in annual budget decisions and negotiations. In addition, public opinion polls consistently rank education as a foremost area of interest for the California public. The Proposition 98 formulas drive off of how much revenue the state takes in, so proposals that change revenues, for example by raising or lowering taxes, can change the Proposition 98 requirements. When considering budget proposals or legislation that have revenue impacts, it is helpful to understand how these interactions might work. And finally, because education is such a key area of interest and a large share of the state budget, and because Proposition 98 plays such a key role in education funding decisions, Proposition 98 is a frequently mentioned topic in the Capitol by members, staffers, media, and constituent groups. It is helpful to have some context of what everyone is talking about.
In this first section of the presentation, we'll cover some general background information about Proposition 98. Voters approved Proposition 98 in 1988 as an amendment to the state's constitution. 2 years later, in 1990, the legislature placed Proposition 111 on the ballot, through which voters approved some modifications to the original initiative. When people discuss Proposition 98, it is sometimes difficult to know exactly what it is that they are talking about. Basically, Proposition 98 established a set of mathematical formulas in the state constitution. Each year, the state must use these formulas to calculate a funding amount. This funding amount is the minimum level the state is required to spend on schools and community colleges in that year. It seems that Proposition 98 has three main goals. First, by establishing a funding requirement, education funding now receives special status in annual budget negotiations. Second, it ensures that the state dedicates a certain proportion of state funding to education to make sure it remains the largest priority funding item. And third, the formulas are designed to keep education funding growing along with the economy. The Proposition 98 requirement is funded by a combination of local property tax revenue and state general fund dollars. As shown in the pie chart on your screen, local property tax revenues generally make up about 1/4 of total funding, while state general fund makes up the remaining 3/4. Proposition 98 funding is provided primarily to K-12 public schools, including charter schools, and the California community colleges. Because of this, we sometimes refer to Proposition 98 as funding K-14 education. Proposition 98 funding is also provided for other state entities that provide public education in non-traditional venues, such as state mental hospitals or detention centers for juvenile offenders. Some funding is also provided for state-run preschool and child care services. There is no Proposition 98 funding, however, provided for the University of California or California State University. As with most areas of state spending, funding levels for these entities are determined as part of the annual budget process. As you can see in the pie chart, Proposition 98 funding for the 2008-9 fiscal year, as amended in February of 2009, provided a total of $51 billion to K-14 education. $45 billion, or about 88%, were provided for K-12 education. $6 billion, or 12%, was provided for the community colleges. Both K-12 schools and community colleges receive funding from other sources, but they primarily rely on Proposition 98 funds for their operation. As you can see in the figure, Proposition 98 funds make up around 75% of total funding for K-14 education. K-12 schools and community colleges also receive significant levels of funding from the federal government and from other local sources. These each total about 10% of funding for K-14 education. The Proposition 98 formulas calculate a required amount that the state must spend on K-14 education, but they are silent as to how those funds can be spent. The legislature has the discretion to determine how these funds will be used. Currently, about 2/3 of Proposition 98 funds are sent to local districts and colleges as general purpose funds to support most personnel and operations costs. A portion of the remaining funds are targeted by the legislature for specific purposes, such as special education, services for disadvantaged students, and after-school programs. In most, but not all years, the formulas result in sufficient year-to-year growth in Proposition 98 funding to provide enrollment and cost of living adjustments to schools and colleges.